In this video, I'll be discussing program 14 called Seconds Converter, which demonstrates how to write a program that involves executing different code based on different conditions. In Java, this is commonly done using if conditional blocks. Here's an example of an if conditional block. It begins with the word if, and then followed by a condition that is wrapped in parentheses, and then it has an open curly brace, and then the lines of code that are executed when the condition is true, and then a closing curly brace. Notice that this condition here is a Boolean expression, and only when the condition is true will these lines of code execute. Let's look at a piece of code that uses an if block. So I have scanner s equals new scanner with system in, and then it's asking for the next int, which we put in the integer variable called num. Now we have an if block. So if, and then parentheses, num is greater than 10, and then we have the curly braces. And if this condition is true, we will output num is greater than 10. Here's another example, but in this case, we are storing the Boolean expression into an actual Boolean variable. If the number entered by the user is greater than 0, then it is positive, and this is true. And then if the Boolean is true, then the lines of code that exist inside this if condition will be executed. So num is positive and num is greater than 0. Here's another example of an if block. In this case, this one's called an if-else block. Same thing, we have an if with a condition wrapped in curly braces, and if this condition is true, then it'll execute these lines of code. However, if this condition is false, then it'll move to the else, and it'll execute these lines of code. So in our example down here, same thing, we have a scanner, we're asking for an integer. If that number is positive, which means it's greater than 0, this is positive will be true. So if is positive, so if that's true, then we'll execute these two system outs. However, if the number is negative, such as a -1, it'll skip this if block and then execute the else block instead. So in this case, -1 is negative. While we're talking about if-else condition blocks, I want to mention quickly how a ternary operator works. And this is an if-else block in a single line. So you have your condition followed by a question mark, and then what to execute if the condition is true, and then a colon, and then what to execute when the condition is false. So looking at this example again, if the number is positive will be true, and then you can see if is positive is true, we're going to add 1 to the number, and then new num will become 1 more. However, if is positive is false, the else will be executed, and new num will become 1 less. The ternary allows us to take these 5 lines and condense them into one line. So if is positive is true, we can do num plus 1. However, if is positive is false, we'll do num minus 1, and the result will be stored in new num. And the last variation of an if-else block is something called an if-else block. And in this case, you'll notice that it's the same as before, where you have a statement starting with the word if, a Boolean expression, and then an open curly brace with some lines of code, and then a closed curly brace. And then on the same line, you have an else if with condition 2. And then open curly brace, closed curly brace, else if, condition 3, and so on. And then the final else block, which has no condition. It's just an open curly brace, lines of code, and then closed curly brace. So how this works is if condition 1 is true, it'll only run these lines in green. But if condition 1 is false, it'll jump and check condition 2. And so lines of code to execute when the first condition is false and the second condition is true. But then you'll notice you can have a third, and you can actually have as many of these else if blocks as you want. So this is condition 3, and these are the lines of code to execute when all previous conditions are false, but this condition is true. So if condition 1 is false and condition 2 is false, but condition 3 is true, then it'll execute these lines of code. And you can keep adding as many as you want of these else ifs, right? So you could have condition 1, condition 2, condition 3, condition 50, and so on. And then you can add at the end, you can add an else, which are the lines of code to execute when all previous conditions were false. So this is like a safety net. If everything else is false, this is the last thing to execute. So looking at the code, we have a scanner asking for an integer, and if the number is greater than 100, we output the number is greater than 100. However, if that is false, let's say the number was 70, 70 is not greater than 100. So then it moves to the next else if. So is 70 greater than 50? Yes, that is true. So 70 is between 51 and 100, and then it just skips the rest. So one thing I want to emphasize is that it will only ever execute one of these condition blocks. So if it executes in this if block, it will not execute anything else. If it executes in any of these else ifs, that's the only block it'll execute. And then if it doesn't execute in any of these, it'll execute the final else block at the end. So one thing I do want to emphasize is the styling. So notice it starts with if, space, and then parentheses around the condition, and then another space, and then an open curly brace, the lines of code, and then a closed curly brace on its own line, and then space, else if, space, condition in parentheses, space, open curly brace, closed curly brace, then a space, else if, and so on. And then a trailing else at the end, so curly brace, else, curly brace, no condition, and then the lines of code, and then at the very end you have your final closing curly brace. Now let's look at the objective for program 14 called seconds converter. So the objective, write a program that asks the user to enter a number, an integer, of seconds. And here are some key points. There are 60 seconds in a minute. If the number of seconds entered by the user is greater than or equal to 60, the program should display the number of minutes equal to the number of specified seconds. There are 3,600 seconds in an hour. If the number of seconds entered by the user is greater than or equal to 3,600, the program should display the number of hours equal to the number of specified seconds. There are 86,400 seconds in a day. If the number of seconds entered by the user is greater than or equal to 86,400, the program should display the number of days equal to the number of specified seconds. If the number of seconds entered by the user is below 60, but still positive, that number should just be displayed to match the input. And lastly, if the number of seconds entered by the user is negative, the program should provide a message. So let's look at some examples. 123,456. 123,456 seconds equals 1.428 repeating days. Or enter the total number of seconds. 12,345. 12,345 seconds equals 3.42916 repeating hours. And then we have 1,234 seconds. 1,234 seconds equals 20.56 repeating minutes. And then we have 12 seconds. 12 seconds equals 12 seconds. And then if the number is negative, such as -1, the message says, no negative numbers. Please run the program again. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see that there is some extra credit here. And the extra credit says, user is prompted for a total number of seconds. This value is converted to the equivalent number of days, minutes, hours, and seconds correctly. The value is outputted exactly as shown in the sample program. If a negative value is received, the program outputs a message and ends. So for example, for the extra credit, if you type in 123,456, it would display 123,456 seconds equals 1 days, 10 hours, 17 minutes, and 36 seconds. As always, to begin working on this program, first create a new workspace for program 14 by following the instructions in my video with the title Create a New Programming Project, or watching the solution to program 2. To view additional materials and the solution code for this program, visit the Java in a Jiffy website at www.javainajiffy.com/programs/14. Once you have completed this program, watch my solution video where I discuss the solutions code and highlight any important concepts and techniques. If you found this video helpful, please click the like button. To help support this channel, please click the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.